In the early morning light, thousands of spectators welcomed to Sydney what was then the largest passenger ship in the world, the Queen Mary II. Almost a century earlier, in December of 1912, few would have noticed the arrival of a new steam collier from the shipbuilding yards in Glasgow, the Tuggerah. Built for the Wallara Coal Company, the ship sailed via the Suez Canal, often experiencing gale force conditions on her 52-day journey to Sydney. Just south of Newcastle is the historic town of Catherine Hill Bay. The Tuggerah's owners, the Wallara Coal Company, reopened the mine and the jetty in 1889. The company operated for more than a century, with both local and interstate colliers using the facilities in the bay. Coal cutting machinery had been introduced at the turn of the century, and at its prime there were over 400 employees. With many of the miners' homes still standing, the settlement appears much the way it did in the early part of the 20th century. The hazards of loading vessels from open sea jetties would become evident over the years. Although the sounds of anchor chains and shunting coal wagons no longer resonate across the bay, beneath the shallow clear waters lie the remnants of vessels that called, but were never to leave. The wreck of the Wallara, the first of 4 vessels to carry that name, lies smashed to pieces in 5 metres of water at the end of the jetty. In April of 1914, as she attempted to leave the wharf, she was blown onto a nearby reef. The dark shape depicted on the sandy bottom, 200 metres out from the beach, is the first steamer wrecked in the bay, the Shamrock. In March of 1903, the 80-metre vessel grounded when a rope fouled around her propeller. Unable to steam to safety, she settled in shallow water and was dismantled where she lay. Covered by sand for much of the year, it is only after huge seas that divers get the opportunity to view her remains. For the next 111 years, colliers loaded at the jetty, until finally in 2001, with the closure of the Wallara mine, the famous 60-mile run came to an end. On May 17th of 1919, huge seas and gale force winds swept the New South Wales coastline, much like this recent scene of a container vessel entering Botany Bay. At 7 a.m. on that Saturday morning, the Tuggerah arrived at Sandon Point, the site of the Bulli Coal Company's jetty. Loading a vessel from a jetty positioned in the open sea was a difficult task, but for the men of the coal trade, it was business as usual. As the work continued throughout the day, the collier was heavily shunted against the wharf. The procedure was almost complete when a misunderstanding between the men operating the coal wagon and the crew resulted in tons of coal spilling onto the deck of the ship. The officer in charge of the loading had cried out, "Stop!" but it was impossible to halt the flow once the trapdoor had been opened. There was a brief exchange of words between both teams before loading continued. Showing a slight list to port, the Tuggerah cast off at 2 p.m. Destination: Sydney Harbour. Despite gale force conditions, the coal trimming in both holds was incomplete. Hatch covers were left off, and most of the coal spilled on the deck remained where it landed. Why the captain left port in such an unseaworthy condition is a question that can never be answered. Watamolla Inlet in the Royal National Park, south of Sydney. By 4 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, the Tuggerah had reached this position, exactly halfway on her voyage between Sydney and Bulli. Just over a nautical mile off the northern headland, the ship was struck by 3 waves, one after the other, forcing her onto her port side. She never recovered. Resting in a depth of 48 metres, the former pride of the Wallara Coal Company lies on her port side on a clean sandy bottom. In superb visibility, the immense size of the wreck can be seen as a diver swims along the keel. This aft section of the vessel remained largely intact. An imposing feature of the Tuggerah is her propeller and rudder, giving this wreck the classic shipwreck appearance. One of the tips of the propeller is broken off. This probably happened as the ship settled stern first into the sand. The Tuggerah's steam engine. Early visitors to the wreck reported human remains beneath the structure. Evidence of several crew members who were never to escape the overturning vessel on that Saturday afternoon in May. Barely recognisable after 90 years beneath the sea, a set of spanners still lie attached to the engine room bulkhead. Intended for the bunkers of some long-forgotten steamship, coal from the Illawarra escarpment lies strewn about the wreck. One of the ship's boilers. Many shipwreck survivors reported boilers exploding as their vessels disappeared under the sea. However, inspections of countless shipwrecks shows this to be untrue. It was simply the cold water reaching the fire doors of the furnace. Forward of the boilers, the hull has completely collapsed, leaving the protruding remains of ribbing and corroded hull plates. As the ship slipped beneath the waves, she paused briefly, allowing half a dozen men the opportunity to free a lifeboat. For the next hour, they circled the area, looking for survivors. One by one, men were picked up and dragged into the safety of the lifeboat. A roll call showed there were 11 men in the boat, but 6 were missing, including the captain and the chief officer. It was the survivors' intention to steer for Guatemala, but the strong southeast gale pushed them towards Port Hacking, some 5 nautical miles north. In darkness, the men navigated the treacherous Gibbon Bombora at the entrance to Port Hacking, and rowed up the river, landing at 7:15 p.m. at the wharf that once existed at Bass and Flinders Point. Survivor Thorvald Thompson was a lucky man. Seen here, convalescing in 1949, he had endured yet another shipwreck 30 years after the Tuggerah's loss. On this occasion, he spent 12 hours in the water, one of only 2 men to survive the wreck of the Bombo off Port Kembla Harbour. Regarded by many as the premier wreck dive in the Sydney area, Tuggerah's marine life is unsurpassed. A delicate sea pen, filter feeding in the sand. An unforgettable encounter with a giant sunfish. The wreck of the Tuggerah, in the right conditions, offers visiting divers the complete wreck diving experience. The Court of Marine Inquiry discussed the Tuggerah's unseaworthy condition when she left port, but with the death of the captain and chief officer who was in charge of the loading, the court controversially declined to name any single person responsible for the tragedy. Perhaps the loss of the Tuggerah could be summed up in the testimony of the second officer, George Tate. He could see that the ship's list was increasing as the voyage continued. However, when asked by the court why he did not pass on his observations to the skipper, Tate replied, "I would have done that with some captains, but not the master of this ship. He never valued my opinion against his own."